In the quiet hum of an airport terminal, where countless travelers move through the polished glass and marble corridors, a single act of quiet cruelty sets in motion a story that will ripple far beyond these walls. This is the story of Marcus Sinclair, a poised and powerful black businessman whose calm resolve and quiet dignity would challenge the comfortable rhythms of prejudice and reshape an entire industry. His journey begins not with an outburst or a headline, but with a single smirk at a boarding counter and a refusal to accept the smallness of those who dared to diminish him. Stay with us as we follow this story of silent reckonings, quiet power, and the indomitable strength of a man who would not be erased. Here's Wolf Side. The morning light slanted through the vast panes of glass at Los Angeles International Airport, casting a soft, almost reverent glow across the polished floors. It was the kind of light that made everything seem a little less harsh, a little less hurried, if only for a moment. Marcus Sinclair paused at the threshold of the terminal, his broad shoulders squared beneath the tailored lines of a black suit that seemed to absorb and reflect the shifting luminescence. In one hand, he gripped the handle of a mahogany suitcase. The other rested lightly at his side, fingers still, composed. There was a quiet gravity in the way he moved, as though each step carried the weight of 1,000 previous journeys, each one a testament to the battles he had fought and won, and the scars he chose to wear as silent symbols of his resilience. He was not new to this place, not new to the invisible negotiations and silent power plays that unfolded behind polite smiles and hushed announcements. The low drone of boarding calls, the clipped conversations of travelers negotiating delays and seat changes, the steady rhythm of rolling luggage wheels on marble floors. It was a symphony he knew well, but today there was a current in the air that felt sharper, more electric, like the charged hush before a storm breaks. Marcus inhaled deeply, letting the breath settle in his chest, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he took in the scene before him. The lines of passengers snaking patiently around barriers, the faint flicker of irritation in tired eyes, the weary grace of flight attendants moving briskly through the crowd. And standing behind the check-in counter, framed by the muted light and the hum of organized chaos, was the woman who would become the unexpected catalyst for everything that was to come. Chloe Patterson. Her name was stitched in neat, impersonal letters on a silver nameplate pinned just below the crisp collar of her uniform. She had the look of someone who had long ago learned to master the delicate art of smiling while judging, of weighing the worth of a person in a single, fleeting glance. Marcus watched her for a moment as she deftly tapped at her keyboard, her movements efficient and controlled, the faint arch of an eyebrow betraying a flicker of condescension that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Marcus had spent a lifetime paying attention to the smallest shifts in tone and body language, to the ways the world tested the patience of those who refused to be quiet, who refused to shrink. He stepped forward, the gentle squeak of his shoes on the floor, a subtle punctuation in the white noise of the terminal. As he approached, Chloe's eyes lifted, and for the briefest instant, something like surprise flickered across her face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the polite, professional expression of someone trained to deal with the public, someone who believed they held the power in every exchange. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice low and warm, tinged with the rich cadence of his heritage. "I'd like to confirm my boarding pass, please. First class, seat 2A. The words were calm, almost casual, but they carried with them the quiet authority of a man who had earned the right to stand there, who had built his empire not through favors or shortcuts, but through unyielding will and unbreakable integrity. Chloe's lips curved into a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Instead, there was a flash of something else, something sharper, something that Marcus recognized instantly. It was the kind of smile that hid a blade behind velvet, the kind that tested the boundaries of patience and dignity. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers still dancing across the keys as she said, almost sweetly, "That's quite an accent you have there." The words were light, meant to sound like a harmless observation, but Marcus heard the subtext clearly. "You don't belong here." He held her gaze, his own face an impassive mask, giving nothing away. Around them, the line of passengers shifted, the air thick with impatience and muted curiosity. But Marcus didn't waver. He had learned long ago that in these small, seemingly insignificant moments, entire systems revealed themselves, sometimes in a single glance, a single smirk. Chloe continued typing, her voice bright and practiced. "It looks like there's been a change in your seating," she said, pausing just long enough to let the words sink in, to let the implication hang in the space between them like a challenge. "You've been reassigned to economy, seat 44E. There was no apology in her tone, no hint of genuine concern, only the smooth, rehearsed delivery of someone who believed their authority would not be questioned. Marcus's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the handle of his suitcase. "I booked 2A, he said quietly, his tone as measured as his breathing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let the weight of the injustice take root in his throat. Instead, he let the words hang there, deliberate and precise. Chloe's smile grew sharper, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Sometimes the system corrects itself," she replied, her tone soft, almost mocking. "Maybe there was an error in the booking. It happens more often than you'd think." Around them, a few passengers glanced over. Their curiosity piqued, but their attention was fleeting. No one wanted to get involved. Marcus felt the cold clarity of the moment settle over him like a second skin. This was no accident. It was a choice, a decision made in the span of a heartbeat by someone who believed that a man like him didn't fit the image they wanted to project. He took another breath, steady and sure, and as he did, he felt the weight of every other moment like this he had ever endured press into his spine, a silent shield forged from years of quiet resistance. He met Chloe's gaze evenly, his own eyes steady and unyielding. In that moment, he understood that this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something much larger, something that ran deeper than the marble floors and glass walls of the terminal. It was about the quiet, relentless calculus of who was welcome and who was merely tolerated, about the subtle, insidious ways that power was wielded and dignity was stolen. And Marcus, standing there in the soft morning light, knew that he would not let it go unanswered. Marcus's fingers relaxed fractionally around the handle of his suitcase as he took another measured breath, steadying himself against the simmering weight of what had just been done to him. He didn't flinch, didn't allow even a flicker of frustration to mar the calm mask he wore so well. Instead, he let the moment settle, let the injustice reveal itself fully, every detail etched into his memory like a scar he chose to remember, not to bury. The low hum of the terminal wrapped around him, the steady churn of people in line, the clack of heels against polished floors, the muted announcements echoing overhead. It was all just noise, a backdrop to the silent theater unfolding at this small counter. He watched Chloe as she turned away, her attention already shifting to the next passenger, a man in cargo shorts clutching a crumpled boarding pass. Her demeanor shifted with a casual ease that made Marcus's jaw tighten, a bright, welcoming smile for him, the easy cadence of helpfulness slipping into her voice like a well-rehearsed song. Marcus noted it all, the effortless dismissal of his presence, the unspoken assertion that he was an inconvenience to be managed, not a customer to be served. It was a performance he had seen many times before, in boardrooms and briefings, in the cold civility of corporate corridors. And as he watched, he felt a slow-burning clarity settle over him, a certainty that what had just happened was not an isolated insult. It was a deliberate exclusion, woven into the very fabric of the system. He shifted his stance slightly, his broad frame commanding a presence even in stillness, and glanced back at the line behind him. Some passengers were fidgeting, tapping impatiently at their phones. Others peered over his shoulder with fleeting curiosity that quickly gave way to discomfort when his gaze met theirs. No one wanted to see it, to name it, to acknowledge the ugliness and the small, precise cruelty of Chloe's smile. And that, Marcus thought, was how this kind of prejudice survived, wrapped in silence, disguised as oversight, allowed to flourish because those who witnessed it turned their faces away. The woman seated closest to the counter, a middle-aged traveler with sleek hair and an expensive handbag at her feet, looked up from her phone as Marcus met her eyes. For a moment, there was something like recognition in her expression, a faint crease of disapproval that flickered across her features before she quickly dropped her gaze, her lips pressing together in a thin line. Marcus let the moment pass without comment, his attention shifting back to Chloe, who was now busy offering cheerful apologies to the man in the cargo shorts for some minor inconvenience, an apology that had been so conspicuously absent in her conversation with him. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" Marcus asked, his voice calm and deliberate, each word weighted with the measured authority of a man who had built his life on refusing to be dismissed. Chloe's eyes narrowed just slightly, her mouth tightening at the corners as she tapped her earpiece, calling for assistance with the strained patience of someone forced to indulge a difficult customer. The delay that followed was deliberate, a performance of bureaucratic indifference that played out in the bored shuffle of feet behind him, in the whispered sighs of fellow passengers eager to move past this uncomfortable moment. Minutes passed in a slow crawl, each second stretching into something heavy and electric. The line behind Marcus grew restless, passengers exchanging glances that darted away when he turned his head. It was a dance he knew well, the collective impatience that masked a deeper, quieter complicity. They didn't want to be part of this, didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truth of what they were witnessing. And so, they shifted, coughed politely, stared at their shoes, anything to avoid meeting the gaze of the man who had been told, without a single word, that he didn't belong. It was then that Lucas, the young staffer who had lingered in the periphery of the scene, approached the counter again. His posture was tentative, his expression uncertain, as he leaned in close to Chloe, his voice low enough that Marcus had to strain to hear the words. "They said he doesn't fit the brand image," Lucas whispered, the confession slipping out like a crack in the wall of practiced silence. "They want him somewhere less visible." For a heartbeat, Marcus felt the breath catch in his throat, not from shock, but from the cold, clinical precision of it. It wasn't just a mistake, wasn't just an error in the system. It was a choice, a decision made with the same quiet ease as a seat reassignment, a small, cutting calculation that judged his worth by the color of his skin, by the sound of his voice. But if Chloe expected him to fold, to let it pass in the name of keeping the peace, she was about to learn that he had never been the type to back down. He offered a small nod of acknowledgement to Lucas, a silent understanding passing between them in the briefest of moments. Marcus's face remained composed, his eyes clear and sharp, every detail of this quiet humiliation branded into his memory. He knew better than to raise his voice here, knew that the real power didn't come from confrontation, but from the quiet, deliberate gathering of truth. And so, he waited, every muscle in his body coiled with a calm, lethal patience. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket, the discreet vibration a signal from his executive assistant far beyond the terminal walls. He glanced down at the screen, reading the single word that lit up in the dim glow. "Ready?" The faintest flicker of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, not of amusement, but of resolve. The game had begun, and Marcus was done waiting. He would not raise his voice. He would not beg for courtesy from those who had already decided he didn't deserve it. But he would make sure that this quiet cruelty, this small moment of dismissal at Gate 24, would be the thread that unraveled something far larger than they could ever imagine. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, his broad shoulders straightening, as he let the quiet of the moment settle around him. He didn't need to glance at his phone again. The message it carried was already etched into his mind like a brand. "Ready!" It was more than a word. It was a promise that the wheels were already turning far beyond the sterile corridors of this terminal, that every slight and smirk he had endured today would not remain a private shame, but would become the catalyst for something far more consequential. Chloe, oblivious to the silent storm gathering beneath Marcus's calm facade, continued her performance of polite efficiency. Her fingers tapped lightly at the keyboard, her lips still curved in that tight, practiced smile that seemed to say, "I hold the power here." Marcus let her have it, for now. Let her believe that she was in control of this small, scripted humiliation. He knew the real game was not played at these counters or with these fleeting performances. It was played in boardrooms and networks that spanned continents, in contracts and alliances that shaped entire industries. And in that world, Marcus Sinclair was not an inconvenience to be managed. He was a force to be reckoned with. He watched the scene unfold around him with a kind of detached clarity, noting every detail with the precision of a surgeon mapping a procedure. The passengers still avoided his gaze, their discomfort palpable in the way they shuffled their feet and fiddled with their phones. Grace, the young flight attendant, moved past him again, her eyes darting up to meet his before flinching away. He saw the tremor in her hands as she adjusted the edge of her uniform, the small, betraying flicker of guilt that she couldn't quite suppress. Marcus didn't blame her. He understood better than most how fear could wrap itself around your throat, how silence could feel like survival when the cost of speaking up was too steep. But understanding didn't mean excusing. Lucas hovered nearby, his expression drawn and pale. He had spoken the truth once, let it slip out in a whisper that still echoed in the space between them. Now he looked like a man grappling with the weight of what he had revealed, his shoulders hunched beneath the thin fabric of his uniform. Marcus caught his eye for a moment, a silent exchange that passed between them like a thread pulled taut. You know, and because you know, you're part of this now. Lucas swallowed hard and turned away, his body language a confession, even if his lips never formed the words. Marcus shifted his focus back to Chloe, who was now helping another passenger, a man in a sharp business suit who spoke with the easy entitlement of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. She laughed softly at something he said, her fingers moving deftly across the keyboard as she reassigned his seat to something more favorable. A small, effortless act of deference that only made the injustice of what she had done to Marcus stand out all the more starkly. He watched her, every movement, every smile, every flicker of her eyes, filing it all away like evidence in a case he was building wordlessly in his mind. The overhead speakers droned on, calling final boarding for flights that had nothing to do with him, the voices smooth and impersonal, a chorus of departures and destinations that felt almost surreal against the quiet fury that coiled low in his chest. Marcus remained seated, his posture composed, the line of his jaw firm. He was in no hurry. He let the minutes stretch out, let the tension build in the air around him until it felt like the entire terminal was holding its breath. He thought of the years he had spent building his company, of the countless miles he had traveled, of the quiet calculations he had made to ensure that no door would ever again be closed to him, because of the color of his skin or the cadence of his voice. He thought of the partners and clients who trusted him, the networks he had nurtured with a precision that was equal parts strategy and survival. And he thought of how easily, how carelessly, Chloe and her polished smile had tried to erase all of that in the span of a single conversation. His phone buzzed again, another discreet signal, a second wave of preparation already in motion. Marcus let out a slow, controlled breath, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he rose from his seat. He didn't need to say a word. Every movement he made, every deliberate step he took, was a declaration in itself. I see you, I see what you've done, and I will not let it stand. He approached the counter one final time, the quiet strength of his presence enough to make Chloe's eyes flicker with a hint of unease. She opened her mouth, her smile ready to slip into place like a mask. But Marcus spoke first, his voice low and steady, the promise of reckoning woven through every syllable. I hope you're ready, he said softly, each word deliberate and unhurried, because this story doesn't end at gate 24. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Chloe standing there with the brittle edges of her smile cracking under the weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. The line of passengers moved forward, the terminal's rhythm resuming around the quiet tremor Marcus had set into motion. But beneath the polished surfaces and polite murmurs, a fracture had begun to spread, a silent quake that would not be stilled by apologies or denials. Marcus Sinclair knew exactly what he was about to do, and this time, no one would be able to look away. Marcus walked slowly through the terminal, each step deliberate, every inch of his posture radiating a calm authority that belied the storm gathering just beneath his skin. He was no stranger to these polished halls, no stranger to the quiet weight of eyes that followed him with that blend of curiosity and caution. But today, he wasn't here to be watched. He was here to watch, to gather, to see every detail that others might miss in their haste to move on. He settled into a seat near the far wall of gate 24, the cool curve of the molded plastic pressing against his back, his mahogany suitcase standing sentinel at his feet. From here, he had a clear view of the counter, of Chloe's forced smiles, and the flickering uncertainty that now tugged at the corners of her mouth. He could see Lucas, too, hovering in the periphery, the young man's eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the passengers he was tasked to assist. There was a tremor in his movements now, a slight hesitation that betrayed the weight of what he had confessed. Marcus folded his hands in his lap, the gesture deceptively relaxed. In truth, every muscle in his body was coiled with a patient fury, every breath a measured act of control. He let his gaze drift across the terminal, the quiet choreography of travel unfolding around him. A mother gently coaxing a restless child into her seat, a businessman checking his watch with a practiced impatience, a pair of college students sharing headphones and laughter. Life went on, oblivious to the silent fracture that had begun to spread beneath their feet. But not everyone was blind. Grace, the young flight attendant, passed by again, her steps quick, her eyes flickering nervously to where Marcus sat. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when she seemed to falter, her hand lifting slightly as if to reach out, to offer something. An apology, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. But fear won out. She dropped her gaze, her fingers tightening around the edge of her sleeve as she hurried on. Marcus watched her go, his expression unreadable, but he saw the struggle in her posture, the way her shoulders hunched as if to hide from the guilt she couldn't quite outrun. Lucas returned to the counter, his shoulders slumped, his face pale beneath the harsh glow of the overhead lights. He avoided Marcus's gaze, but the tension in his frame spoke volumes. Marcus knew the young man's conscience was gnawing at him, knew that the words he had let slip, those quiet admissions of prejudice disguised as policy, had become a weight he couldn't shake. But for now, Lucas said nothing, his silence as loud as any shouted confession. Chloe, meanwhile, was trying to reassert her control, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she reassigned seats with a mechanical precision that was starting to crack at the edges. Her smile was thinner now, her movements sharper, the brittle facade of professionalism revealing the small, jagged cracks beneath. Marcus watched her carefully, noting the way her eyes darted to the side when she thought no one was watching, the quick, shallow breaths she tried to hide. He let them all perform their parts, let them believe that they had successfully contained this small act of cruelty, this fleeting moment of exclusion that they thought would be forgotten as soon as the boarding call sounded. But Marcus knew better. He had learned, through years of navigating spaces that were never truly made for men like him, that the real power didn't lie in confrontation. It lay in observation, in remembering, in turning the quiet humiliations into fuel for something far more permanent. The overhead speakers crackled to life, announcing final boarding for a flight bound for distant shores, a destination that suddenly felt both impossibly close and utterly irrelevant. Marcus didn't move. He wasn't here to leave. He was here to bear witness, to ensure that this moment, so small in the eyes of those who had orchestrated it, would become the thread that unraveled the entire tapestry of their polite prejudice. Around him, the terminal pulsed with the oblivious rhythm of travel. Passengers gathered their bags and their boarding passes, eager to move on, to slip back into the comforting illusion of order and civility. But Marcus knew that beneath the surface, the cracks were already widening, that the small act of disrespect at Gate 24 would echo far beyond these walls. His phone buzzed again, a silent signal that the first waves of consequence were already beginning to ripple outward. He let the vibration settle in his palm, his eyes still fixed on the scene before him, his mind already mapping the next steps. Chloe's smile, Lucas's hesitation, Grace's trembling hands, every detail was a piece of the story he would soon bring to light. A story not of anger, but of truth, not of vengeance, but of justice. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, the faint creak of the plastic chair the only sound he made. Around him, the world continued to move, blind to the quiet reckoning it had already set in motion. And as he sat there, his gaze steady and unyielding, he thought not of the flight he had been denied, but of the quiet, certain knowledge that what had begun here today would not be the end of his journey. It would be the beginning. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched Chloe greet the next passenger with a practiced cheer that rang hollow in the cool air of the terminal. Her bright smile had become a brittle mask, and he could see the faint tremor in her fingers as she handed over a new boarding pass. The edges of her facade were cracking, the easy confidence she had displayed when she dismissed him slipping away like water through a sieve. But Marcus didn't look away. He let his gaze rest on her, steady and calm, a silent reminder that he was still there, that he had seen everything. A few seats away, Lucas hovered nervously, his eyes flickering to Marcus before darting away again. His shoulders hunched beneath the weight of the secret he carried, the quiet knowledge that he had been complicit in something that could no longer be hidden behind polite words and polished counters. Marcus saw the guilt etched into every line of his posture, the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of his uniform, as if trying to smooth away the evidence of his own unease. Grace passed by once more, her steps quick, her eyes skimming the floor as she moved past the rows of passengers clutching their bags and tickets. Marcus watched her too, saw the conflict that played out in the tension of her shoulders, the way her lips pressed into a thin line when she thought no one was watching. She was young, caught between the rules she had been taught to follow, and the quiet voice of her own conscience that whispered this was wrong. And though she hadn't found the courage to speak yet, Marcus saw the way her gaze flickered back to him, saw the question in her eyes. Will you fight? Will you stand up? He didn't need to answer. His very presence was an answer. The overhead announcements droned on, a background hum of destinations and flight numbers that felt strangely disconnected from the storm brewing in this small corner of the terminal. Passengers continued to move around him, some casting quick, curious glances in his direction before quickly looking away, eager to avoid the discomfort of what they knew was unfolding. Marcus didn't blame them. He had spent enough of his life in rooms full of people who pretended not to see, to know exactly how the game was played. But he wasn't here to play games anymore. He let his phone buzz again, a small vibration against his thigh that carried with it the weight of everything he had set in motion. Legal teams, logistical experts, trusted allies who understood that what had happened here wasn't just an insult to Marcus. It was an insult to every man and woman who had ever been told, in the quiet language of dismissals and seat changes, that they didn't belong. And even now, as Chloe continued her performance behind the counter, as Lucas tried and failed to hide the guilt in his eyes, Marcus knew that the real work had already begun. He rose slowly from his seat, the movement deliberate, measured, every inch of his posture radiating the quiet confidence of a man who refused to be erased. He walked toward the window, the cool glass reflecting back the image of a man who had weathered 1,000 small humiliations and had never let them break him. Outside, the runway stretched out beneath the pale morning sky, the distant shapes of planes glinting silver as they taxied for departure. It was a view he knew well, a landscape of motion and possibility that had always felt like both an invitation and a test. Marcus rested his hand on the window ledge, his reflection clear and unwavering in the glass. In that mirrored image, he saw not just himself, but every time he had been told to wait, to be patient, to accept less. Every time he had been measured not by his achievements, but by the assumptions of those who couldn't see past his skin. And he saw, too, the quiet resolve that had carried him through every battle, every dismissal, saw it shining in his eyes like the first edge of dawn. Behind him, he heard Chloe's voice rise slightly as she dealt with another passenger, the brittle cheer cracking under the weight of her own unease. He didn't turn to watch her. He didn't need to. He had already seen enough. And as he stood there, the low murmur of the terminal swirling around him, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. This would not be forgotten. This would not be allowed to stand. He would not let the small, careful humiliations of this day be lost in the shuffle of polite apologies and practiced indifference. He would carry them with him, and he would turn them into something stronger than any seat assignment or boarding pass, a quiet, unyielding force that would ripple outward until it reached every corner of the world he moved through. As Marcus lingered by the window, the muted sounds of the terminal washed over him in a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, the mechanical voice of the intercom announcing final calls, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional echo of laughter that felt distant and detached. But within that hum of routine, there was an undercurrent he could almost taste, an electric sense of something shifting, something about to break free from the polite choreography of departure and arrival. His phone buzzed once more in his pocket, and he let it vibrate against his thigh without pulling it free. He didn't need to check. The signals were no longer just words on a screen. They were a quiet pulse, a rhythm of readiness that beat in time with his own heartbeat. It was the music of action, of consequences set in motion by a single act of quiet cruelty. Marcus's eyes flickered to the reflection of his own face in the glass, calm and unwavering, even as the weight of this moment settled more firmly on his shoulders. He turned slightly, letting his gaze sweep back across the terminal. Chloe was still there, her back stiff, her voice just a little too bright as she continued to process passengers, her hands moving with an almost frantic precision that spoke of a mind no longer entirely focused on the task at hand. Lucas stood a few paces away, pretending to be absorbed in the small screen of his handheld scanner, but Marcus saw the way his shoulders tensed every time his name was called over the intercom, the way his eyes flicked up, searching, always searching, for some sign of forgiveness he knew would not come so easily. Grace reappeared, her steps quick, the quiet grace of her movements belied by the nervous flutter of her fingers at her sides. As she passed by, her eyes met Marcus's for a single, breathless moment. There was no smile, no apology, just the raw, unspoken weight of understanding that passed between them like a secret. She looked away quickly, but he saw the faint flush of shame that colored her cheeks, the way her lips parted as if to speak, before closing again around the words she couldn't quite bring herself to say. And in that silent exchange, Marcus saw everything he needed to know. He saw the quiet complicity of those who looked away, the soft betrayals of those who had been taught to keep their heads down, to stay out of the path of the storm. But he also saw the flickers of doubt, the small cracks in the armor of indifference that had been carefully cultivated in this place. And he knew that it was enough, because once those cracks appeared, they could only widen. Once the seed of awareness had been planted, it could only grow. He shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders back as he let the weight of his decision settle more firmly in his chest. There would be no outburst here, no loud declaration of injustice. That was not his way. His power had never come from raising his voice. It had always come from the quiet certainty of his actions, from the deliberate, methodical precision with which he wielded the tools at his disposal. And today, he had all the tools he needed. His phone buzzed again, and this time he slipped his hand into his pocket, his thumb swiping across the screen with a practiced ease. The message was brief, a single line from his legal team. Contracts in motion. The words were a quiet promise, a confirmation that the tremor he had felt beneath his feet was no illusion. It was the first ripple of the earthquake he had set in motion. He tucked the phone away and let his gaze drift back to Chloe, who was laughing softly at something a passenger had said, the sound brittle and forced. She didn't look at him, but he could feel her awareness of his presence like a weight in the air between them. She knew. And though she might not yet understand the full extent of what was coming, she knew that the easy comfort of dismissal had been stripped away. Marcus let out a slow breath, the air cool in his lungs, grounding him in the moment. This was just the beginning. The real work would unfold in boardrooms and back channels, in contracts quietly revoked and alliances severed without fanfare. It would unfold in the steady, unyielding dismantling of a system that had believed it could erase him with a single smirk, a single reassignment. And it would unfold in the quiet, unshakable resolve of a man who had spent a lifetime turning every act of exclusion into a foundation for something greater. He didn't need to watch Chloe squirm or see Lucas wrestle with his conscience. He didn't need to hear Grace's apology or the murmured regrets of passengers who would soon pretend this moment had never happened. All he needed was the quiet knowledge that the balance had shifted, that the weight of silence had been broken. And as he turned back to the window, the planes outside glinting silver in the pale light, Marcus let himself smile, just a small, fleeting curve of his lips. It was enough. Marcus let the quiet swell of resolve settle into his bones, the rhythmic pulse of his heartbeat steady beneath the tailored jacket he wore like armor. The planes outside continued their slow, stately dance, taxiing and lifting into the air, engines humming with a mechanical grace that felt almost serene against the undercurrent of tension he had set loose in this place. But for him, the stillness was not a pause. It was a gathering of power, a deliberate breath before the next, inevitable movement. He turned away from the window, his eyes scanning the terminal with a deliberate calm. Passengers had begun to board their flights, the line at the gate dwindling as each group was called, and the terminal settled into that brief hush that falls between the last call and the final departure. Chloe's voice had grown tighter, the forced cheer slipping further with every passenger she processed. The edges of her professionalism had begun to fray, though she tried to hide it behind her bright corporate smile. Marcus watched her for a moment longer, the brittle edges of her composure as clear to him as if they had been drawn in ink on her skin. Lucas had retreated to a corner, his handheld scanner clutched like a talisman against the shifting tide. Marcus saw the conflict in his face, the guilt that had settled into the lines around his mouth, the way his shoulders hunched as if to make himself smaller. He was young, too young perhaps, to have learned yet that silence is its own kind of complicity. But Marcus also knew that the lesson had begun. The quiet shame in Lucas's eyes was proof enough of that. And Grace, the young flight attendant, lingered near the jet bridge, her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned white. Marcus could see the way her eyes kept darting toward him, the way her lips pressed into a line of uncertainty and fear. He didn't blame her for her silence. He had lived long enough to know how easily fear could be mistaken for prudence. But he also knew that once you saw injustice, once you let it settle into the back of your mind like a stone in a shoe, it could never be fully ignored again. He let his gaze sweep back to Chloe, catching the moment when her eyes met his and quickly looked away, a flicker of unease passing across her features like a shadow. She would remember him, Marcus thought, long after the last flight of the day had lifted into the night sky. She would remember the quiet steadiness of his presence, the way he had refused to let her small, calculated cruelty pass unnoticed. And that memory, he knew, would haunt her more than any raised voice or public outburst ever could. The boarding calls came and went, the final stragglers moving down the jet bridge, and still Marcus did not move. He sat, his posture easy but unyielding, his suitcase resting at his feet like a silent sentinel. Around him, the terminal began to empty, the lines fading into quiet pockets of waiting and whispered conversation. But he remained an anchor in the shifting tide, a reminder that some wounds, no matter how small, demanded to be acknowledged. He glanced at his phone one last time, reading the final message from his assistant. All prepared. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had built, everything he had fought for. The quiet dignity of those words was enough to steady the faint tremor he felt in his chest, to remind him that what he was doing here was not just for himself, but for every man who had ever been told he was too much, too different, too unworthy of the spaces he had earned the right to occupy. With one final breath, Marcus rose from his seat. The motion was smooth, measured, each inch of his movement deliberate as he gathered his coat around his shoulders. He took a moment to let the air settle around him, the faint echo of footsteps on marble floors, the only sound in the cavernous space. And then he turned, his eyes sweeping the length of the terminal one last time. He would not look back. He didn't need to. The reckoning he had set in motion would unfold whether he watched or not. A quiet storm that would ripple outward from this small, forgettable gate until it touched every corner of the world that had once tried to pretend he didn't exist. And as he walked away, his head high and his stride unbroken, Marcus Sinclair carried with him the quiet conviction of a man who had turned the smallest of humiliations into the first strike of a new beginning. As Marcus walked away from Gate 24, each step echoed softly in the cavernous terminal, his polished shoes moving with a quiet authority that belied the invisible storm he had already set in motion. He did not look back. He did not need to. Every breath, every stride, was a silent declaration that what had happened here would not be buried in the dust of routine, would not be forgotten in the sterile hum of departures and arrivals. He passed rows of passengers, some slouched in seats, others bent over phones and laptops, lost in the glow of distant conversations. Most didn't notice him, and those who did quickly looked away, their curiosity giving way to that subtle discomfort that always followed in the wake of a confrontation they didn't understand and didn't want to. But Marcus understood. He had lived long enough to know how easily people turned their faces from truths that made them uneasy, how quickly they chose comfort over conscience. He moved with deliberate calm, each step measured, his suitcase gliding silently behind him like a shadow. The terminal, usually a place of bustling anonymity, seemed to recede around him, the conversations muffled, the bright lights dimmed by the weight of what had just unfolded. He let it wash over him, the low murmur of the intercom, the muted clatter of luggage wheels, the distant cough of a tired traveler, all of it a testament to how easily the world moved on, how swiftly it swallowed up the small humiliations of men like him. But not this time. He paused near a wide column of glass, the light from outside fractured into pale beams that cut across his reflection. In that mirrored image, he saw not just himself, a man of measured resolve and deliberate composure, but the quiet fury that had carried him through boardrooms and conference calls, that had turned every slight and every dismissal into fuel for something stronger than any apology could ever offer. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a steady fire. From his vantage point, he could still see the counter at Gate 24, could see Chloe's tight smile as she shuffled papers and adjusted her headset, her movements sharp and brittle. He could see Lucas, too, standing a little apart, his gaze flickering nervously across the emptying terminal, the memory of his whispered confession lingering in the slump of his shoulders. And somewhere further down the hall, Grace moved briskly, her steps too quick, her eyes too wide, as though she could outrun the moment she had chosen to remain silent. Marcus let out a slow breath, the air cool and steady in his lungs. He had learned, long ago, that real change did not come from the loud public moments. It came from the quiet, private reckonings that followed, from the way a single moment of injustice could fracture a system built on silent complicity. And as he stood there, watching the last of the passengers file past the gate, he knew that the fracture had already begun to spread. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather of his phone. A quick glance confirmed what he already knew. His team had begun the work, the contracts already in motion, the silent withdrawal of trust and support that would ripple outward like a wave, untraceable but unstoppable. Marcus smiled faintly, the expression small but fierce, a private acknowledgement of the quiet power he had learned to wield. He turned from the window and began to walk again, his stride unhurried, his coat moving like a shadow around his legs. He passed the security checkpoint with a nod to the guard who barely looked up, past a mother coaxing a child into a stroller, past a line of tired travelers clutching coffee cups and boarding passes. To them, he was just another man passing through, another suit in a sea of anonymity. But to Marcus, every step was a declaration. I am here. I see you. And I will not be erased. The final boarding call for Gate 24 crackled overhead, the voice flat and mechanical. But it was already too late. The moment had passed, but the reckoning had only just begun. And as Marcus made his way through the terminal, the small, sharp tremor he had set in motion continued to spread, a silent promise that what had been done in the shadows would not remain hidden forever. The terminal's low hum of voices and movement seemed to recede into a distant, almost muffled thrum as Marcus walked steadily toward the main concourse, his head held high, his mind already mapping the quiet battle that had begun. The glow of departure boards and polished marble floors reflected the steely set of his jaw, the measured calm of his stride. Each step was a silent vow, every breath an affirmation of the dignity that no boarding pass or smirk could take away. He moved with a deliberateness that belied the crackling urgency in the quiet messages pulsing across his phone's screen. Updates flowed in from his team, legal counsel finalizing termination clauses, alliances shifting in the shadows, silent partners ready to pull back the tide of support that once flowed unchallenged. There were no headlines, no public statements, just the cold, quiet withdrawal of trust and opportunity, a recalibration of relationships that no gate agent could see coming. He paused near the lounge entrance, a sleek glass doorway reflecting the morning light. Inside, business travelers reclined in leather chairs, screens flickering with emails and muted stock reports, the air perfumed with expensive cologne and quiet entitlement. Marcus didn't enter. He didn't need to. His power was never about the trappings of luxury or the deference of attendants who offered polite smiles. His power was in the alliances he commanded, in the way his quiet decisions would ripple outward, invisible but devastating. A young woman in a crisp uniform approached the counter just inside the lounge, her posture straight but her eyes flickering with uncertainty as she caught sight of Marcus's reflection. She hesitated, lips parting as if to offer a greeting or an apology, but Marcus simply inclined his head, his expression unreadable. He had no need for her words. The reckoning he had set in motion was already well beyond the realm of small gestures and hollow contrition. Lucas emerged from a side corridor, his steps hesitant, his face pale beneath the harsh overhead lights. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Lucas looked as though he might speak, might try to unburden the weight that had begun to settle across his shoulders. But the words caught in his throat, his mouth working soundlessly before he turned away, his shoulders sagging. Marcus didn't chase him. The young man had already spoken the only truth that mattered, an unintentional confession that had cracked the thin veneer of professionalism wide open. That was enough. Further down the terminal, Marcus could see Chloe still at her post, her smile flickering at the edges as she processed the final passengers. The easy confidence she had worn like a second skin was gone now, replaced by a brittle focus that cracked every time her eyes met the empty space where Marcus had once stood. She was learning, in the slow, aching way that always followed a moment of carelessness, that some wounds cut deeper than policy, that some wrongs could not be smoothed over with scripted apologies and forced smiles. Marcus's phone buzzed once more, a final confirmation from his assistant that everything was in place. He read it in a single glance, his lips pressing into a faint line of satisfaction. It wasn't vengeance he felt. It was a quiet, resolute conviction, a promise to himself and to every person who had ever been made to feel lesser by a smile that cut like a knife. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. The weight of his presence, the strength of his silence, had spoken louder than any shouted demand ever could. He turned from the lounge entrance and continued his walk, his posture unyielding, his steps steady. Around him, the terminal resumed its rhythm, boarding calls and overhead announcements, travelers scanning screens and sipping coffee, the comforting hum of movement that had long been a cover for the quiet injustices that thrived beneath it. But today, something had shifted. The easy comfort of looking away had been shaken. The fragile safety of silence cracked open by a man who refused to be diminished. And as Marcus moved through the final stretch of the concourse, the knowledge settled in his chest like a promise. This was only the beginning. What had been set in motion here would not be undone by denials or quick fixes. The quiet storm he had carried with him for so long had finally found its voice, and the world, polished and indifferent though it tried to remain, would have no choice but to listen. Marcus's steps carried him past the final gate in the terminal, his gaze steady, his shoulders square against the muted flow of passengers who moved around him like a river parting at his quiet insistence. The low murmur of boarding calls rose and fell in the background, but to him, it was a distant echo, a chorus of routine that no longer touched the certainty he carried within. Each stride was a deliberate choice, each breath a calm declaration that he would not be defined by the smallness of others' imaginations. He paused near a bank of windows that overlooked the tarmac, the morning light slanting in long, golden beams that caught in the smooth lines of his suit, illuminating the quiet power that lay coiled beneath the measured set of his jaw. Outside, planes glided into position, their engines thrumming with a promise of distance, of departure, of possibility. Marcus watched them with a kind of quiet reverence, the way a man might watch the tide come in, knowing that what moved out there was only a reflection of the deeper currents stirring within himself. Behind him, he heard the soft click of heels. Grace. She hesitated at the edge of his peripheral vision, her hands clenched at her sides, her posture tight with uncertainty. For a moment, she hovered there, the words she wanted to speak trembling on the tip of her tongue. But when she finally stepped forward, her voice was no louder than a breath. "Sir," she said, her tone careful, her eyes darting away before meeting his. I'm sorry." It was a whisper, a confession wrapped in the fragile truce of professionalism. But Marcus heard the truth in it, the faint crack in the wall of her silence. He turned to her fully, his expression calm, his gaze unwavering. "I know," he said softly, each word deliberate, the weight of years of similar confessions pressing into the space between them. He didn't need her apology. It wasn't for him. It was for her, a chance to set down the burden of her own complicity, even if only for a moment. He nodded once, a silent benediction that said, "I see you. I see what you're trying to do, and that is enough." Grace lowered her eyes, a faint flush of relief coloring her cheeks, and stepped back, her shoulders easing just slightly. It wasn't absolution. Marcus wasn't here to absolve, but it was acknowledgement, a quiet thread of connection in a place that had done everything it could to teach them both to look away. He watched her retreat, her figure small and purposeful as she slipped back into the machinery of travel, her steps a little more certain now. And then he turned his gaze back to the window, to the sleek shapes of planes and the quiet sweep of runways stretching into the horizon. The horizon had always been a promise to him, a place where he could build something better than the spaces that had tried to keep him small. Today, that promise felt closer than ever. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, the message short and decisive. Complete. Marcus closed his eyes for the briefest moment, letting the quiet finality of the words settle in his chest. It was done. The contracts, the partnerships, the silent power that had once propped up the comfortable illusions of people like Chloe, withdrawn. Not with shouts or headlines, but with the quiet, unyielding precision that had always been his strength. He slipped the phone back into his coat, his fingers brushing the soft lining as he straightened his shoulders one last time. Around him, the terminal hummed with the soft, oblivious rhythm of routine. Families gathering luggage, flight crews checking manifests, the distant crackle of an intercom calling another group to the gate. But to Marcus, it was all background music to a moment of quiet triumph. He had come here today as one man. He would leave as the quiet force that had reminded this place, this industry, that dignity was not a privilege to be bestowed or revoked at whim. It was an unassailable truth that he carried within himself. And as he turned from the window and began to walk again, each step a measured echo on the polished floor, Marcus Sinclair felt the quiet certainty of a man who had never been more sure of his own power. He did not need applause. He did not need witnesses. The reckoning he had set in motion would ripple outward in ways they could never contain. And for Marcus, that was enough. Marcus stepped into the quieter corridor that curved away from the main concourse, the hum of the terminal fading behind him as he moved into a stretch of empty space. The distant voices and the rhythmic drone of announcements softened to a low murmur, like the memory of a conversation long past. Here, the light was softer, filtered through high windows that cast gentle patterns across the floor, and for a moment, it felt almost like a sanctuary, a place apart from the friction of the world he had just left behind. He paused at a small alcove, the polished wall cool beneath his fingertips, and let himself breathe. Not in relief, he felt no need for relief, but in quiet affirmation, a slow, deliberate filling of his lungs that anchored him in this moment. He had walked this path 1,000 times, through airports and boardrooms, through meetings and quiet conversations that reshaped entire landscapes without a single raised voice. And each time, he had learned that the most profound shifts began not with noise, but with a single, unwavering choice to refuse the smallness others tried to impose upon him. He straightened his jacket, the familiar weight of it across his shoulders, a reminder of everything he had built and everything he carried. His phone buzzed once more, and he drew it from his pocket, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his features in the muted light. A message from his chief counsel. "It's done. All vendors and partners notified." Marcus's lips curved faintly, a quiet satisfaction that reached his eyes but did not touch the calm composure of his face. The final boarding call for Gate 24 echoed distantly down the corridor, a hollow announcement that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Marcus tucked the phone away, his fingers lingering on the smooth leather case before he let it slip back into his coat. The flight he had been denied was of no consequence. What mattered was the flight he had set in motion, the quiet, unstoppable departure of trust and loyalty from those who had believed his presence could be so easily erased. He walked on, his steps sure and unhurried, the silence of the empty corridor wrapping around him like a cloak. Ahead, a glass door opened into a small observation area, a narrow ledge of space that looked out across the runways and the wide, endless sky beyond. Marcus paused at the threshold, his reflection faint in the glass, the steady set of his shoulders and the calm, deliberate stillness in his eyes. The sun was climbing higher now, the light bright and sharp against the distant tarmac, and he let his gaze rest there for a long moment. The quiet expanse of sky, a perfect mirror for the clarity in his own mind. He thought of Chloe's tight smile and Lucas's hunched shoulders, of Grace's whispered apology and the brittle edge of discomfort that had crackled through the air at Gate 24. He thought of the way silence could be a weapon and the way he had turned it into something else entirely, a shield, a testament, a quiet demand that could not be ignored. And as he stood there, the planes lifting and descending in their endless choreography, Marcus understood that what he had done here today was more than a reaction to a single slight. It was a blueprint, a quiet, unassailable map of how dignity was reclaimed in a world that too often tried to steal it away. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun settle against his skin, and when he opened them again, there was no doubt in his gaze. The real work, he knew, had only just begun, but he was ready to turn every closed door into an opening, every dismissal into a chance to build something stronger, something truer. And in the quiet of that small, sunlit space, Marcus felt the steady pulse of his own heart, calm, unshakable, and sure. He turned from the window at last, the soft echo of his steps filling the corridor as he walked back into the world he had already begun to reshape. Marcus walked with the measured calm of a man who understood that true power was never in the noise of confrontation. It was in the quiet, deliberate movement of systems and alliances. As he approached the central concourse, the terminal's hum returned to wrap around him, the soft shuffle of feet, the clipped instructions of flight attendants, the low murmur of travelers weaving in and out of gate lines. But to Marcus, these were no longer just the familiar sounds of an airport. They were the backdrop to a reckoning that had already begun to reverberate beyond these walls. He paused at a small seating area, leather chairs arranged around a low table littered with outdated magazines. An older man in a dark blazer looked up as Marcus passed, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second before dropping again to the phone in his hand. Marcus recognized the flicker of unease, the quick calculation of a man who could sense the shift in the air even if he didn't understand its source. The ripple of what had happened at Gate 24 was already moving outward, invisible but undeniable. He took a seat at the far end of the row, his posture relaxed but his gaze steady. From this vantage, he could see the quiet choreography of the terminal's staff, the subtle undercurrent of tension in the way Lucas moved behind the counter, the way Grace's shoulders tensed every time she caught sight of him across the floor. Marcus watched them, not with anger, but with the calm scrutiny of a man who knew that what they had tried to bury would not stay buried for long. His phone buzzed again, a short, secure message from his office. Vendor contracts suspended, internal reviews launched. He read the words without a flicker of surprise, slipping the device back into his pocket with the same deliberate care he had shown in every step he had taken since this morning began. This was not the work of a moment. This was the patient, unyielding work of principle, the kind of work that did not need to shout to be heard. A few seats away, a young woman with a baby in her arms shifted uncomfortably, her eyes meeting his for a brief instant before she looked away, her lips pressing together in a faint line of apology she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. Marcus offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of understanding. He knew what it was to carry the weight of silence, to feel the tension in every polite exchange that never said quite enough. But today, he wasn't here to accept that silence as a final verdict. He rose from his seat, the soft creak of leather giving way to the quiet confidence of his stride. Around him, the world continued to move, families gathering their bags, businessmen checking the time, the endless cycle of departure and arrival that gave this place its pulse. But for Marcus, every moment was a testament to the truth he had carried with him since the first slight smirk at the counter. Dignity was not a seat number or a boarding pass. It was a birthright. And today he had claimed it without raising his voice. As he moved through the terminal, he let his mind stretch beyond these walls, beyond this morning. He thought of the boardrooms that would soon feel the cold recalibration of his decisions, of the vendors and partners who would be called to account in ways that left no room for excuses or half-hearted apologies. He thought of the quiet conversations that would ripple outward in the days and weeks to come, reshaping alliances and rewriting the story of what had happened here, and he felt no need to rush. The work of truth, he knew, did not need urgency to be felt. It only needed resolve. The overhead announcements rose and fell around him, a soothing rhythm of travel that belied the subtle tremor of change beneath it. Marcus's steps were sure, his posture easy but unbreakable, and in his eyes was the quiet fire of a man who had refused to be diminished by a single act of thoughtless prejudice. The game had shifted, and though the players might not yet understand the new rules, Marcus did. And that was enough. As Marcus continued down the polished hallways of the terminal, he felt the subtle shift in the air around him, a hush that was not spoken, but was felt in the slight hesitation of every step he passed, in the quick flicker of eyes that met his before darting away. The terminal had become a living echo of the moment he had left behind at Gate 24, every surface holding the weight of the silent question that now pulsed beneath the hum of routine. Who was this man, and what had he set in motion? He paused near a row of departure screens, the glowing text scrolling through a list of cities and gate numbers in crisp white letters. He didn't need to search for his own flight. He no longer cared for destinations that relied on the permission of those who believed they could decide his worth. His journey had already taken him far beyond these gates, beyond the polished marble and the polite murmurs of the staff who moved around him, with the tight smiles of those who sensed, on some instinctive level, that the ground had shifted under their feet. From this vantage point, Marcus could see the security officers at their posts, their stances rigid, their eyes flickering briefly to him and then away. They were trained to see everything, and to see nothing at all when it was inconvenient. He watched them without judgment, knowing that they too were part of the quiet machinery that kept places like this running, that turned away from questions that might crack the illusion of control. But today, that machinery had faltered, however briefly, and he carried that fracture with him like a badge of honor. His phone vibrated again, another brief message. All cleared. Marcus let the words settle in the back of his mind, a final piece of assurance that the work he had set in motion had already begun to remake the world around him. Contracts had been revoked, vendor relationships severed in silent precision, the airline's complacency challenged not with raised voices or angry letters, but with the quiet, methodical recalibration of every tie they had once taken for granted. He moved again, his stride smooth and unhurried, the faint click of his shoes a steady drumbeat beneath the endless drone of departure announcements. As he walked, he caught sight of Grace in the distance, her face pale but her posture different now, no longer the nervous shuffle of someone trying to avoid complicity, but the hesitant, upright stance of someone who had seen the truth and could no longer unsee it. Their eyes met across the polished floor, and for a heartbeat, everything around them seemed to fall away. She nodded to him, a small, solemn acknowledgement, and he answered it with the faintest lift of his chin. No words were needed. She would carry the weight of what she had seen, as he had carried it for years. And in that small gesture, he saw the possibility of a different kind of future, one that began not with the roar of confrontation, but with the quiet decision to no longer look away. As Marcus turned away, he let his eyes sweep one last time across the terminal. The space that had once tried to diminish him now lay behind him like a stage stripped of its false lights, the brittle illusions of power exposed in the quiet aftermath. He had come here today as a traveler, but he would leave as something more, a quiet architect of change, a testament to the power of a man who refused to let the world define him by the color of his skin or the sound of his voice. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air filling his lungs with the cool clarity of purpose. Every step he had taken, every silent exchange and calculated decision, had been part of a larger movement, one that stretched far beyond these glass walls and departure gates. And as he stepped back into the flow of the terminal, Marcus carried with him the certainty that the world was already shifting in response. He didn't need the applause of those who had watched in silence. He didn't need the hollow contrition of those who would soon scramble to cover their tracks. All he needed was the truth he carried in his heart, and the quiet, unyielding certainty that what had begun here today would ripple outward, impossible to ignore, impossible to erase. Marcus moved through the final stretch of the terminal, the low hum of rolling suitcases and quiet announcements washing over him like a distant tide. In this space, every sound and flicker of movement felt both heightened and muted, the aftershocks of what had happened at Gate 24 still vibrating in the polished marble under his feet. But Marcus carried that weight with a calm dignity, every line of his posture a quiet testament to the unshakable truth he held within him. He paused near an alcove that overlooked the concourse, the glass walls framing the bustling movements of travelers below. From here, he could see the check-in counters, the last-minute lines of passengers anxious to be somewhere else, anywhere else. He could see the staff at their posts, their uniforms pressed and their smiles careful, and in their movements, he could feel the slight, uneasy tremor of an order that had been so carelessly disrupted. Chloe was nowhere in sight now, but Marcus could almost feel the echo of her brittle smile in the air around him, a reminder of the small, casual cruelty she had wielded without thought. But her absence did not matter. What he had come here to do was done. The fracture she had caused, the small act of dismissal that had once seemed so inconsequential to her, had become the fulcrum for something larger than she could ever have imagined. He leaned against the cool glass, his reflection a dark silhouette against the bright flow of movement beyond. In that quiet moment, he let himself feel the slow, deliberate breath of triumph, not the hot rush of vengeance, but the steady pulse of a man who had claimed his own narrative and rewritten it in silence. There was power in that, a power deeper and more lasting than any public spectacle could ever hold. Below, he watched as a family hurried to their gate, the father balancing a small child on his hip, while the mother smoothed the girl's hair, her voice low and soothing. He saw the businessman with his immaculate suit and his phone pressed tight to his ear, the college student with a battered backpack, and the restless excitement of youth in his stride. Each of them moved with the singular focus of their own journeys, their own destinations. And Marcus understood that, in the end, it was the dignity of every journey that mattered most. His phone buzzed once more, a final confirmation from his chief advisor. Complete, all relationships reevaluated. Marcus's fingers tightened fractionally around the device, then relaxed. It was not just the formal closure of contracts or the quiet severing of ties. It was a declaration of intent, a clear and final statement that he would never again accept a seat in the shadows of someone else's assumptions. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned away from the window, the low glow of the departure boards reflecting in his calm, unwavering gaze. Around him, the terminal pulsed with its own private stories, every handshake and boarding pass a testament to the endless movement of people and possibilities. But Marcus was no longer just another traveler caught in the flow. He was the quiet, unshakable force that would outlast the echoes of this morning. As he stepped away from the glass, he carried with him not the bitterness of what had been done, but the quiet certainty of what he had undone. In the hush of that final walk, he knew that the story would not end with the closing of the gate or the final boarding call. It would live on in the recalibrated alliances, in the conversations whispered behind closed doors, in the small, sharp adjustments of conscience that would ripple outward long after he had left these polished floors behind. He did not need to see Chloe's face again. He did not need to hear the stammered apologies that would follow in his wake. Marcus knew that the world was already shifting around the quiet fault line he had laid bare, and that was enough. Marcus stepped into the final corridor that led to the exit, the pale morning light streaming through the wide windows like a soft, steady benediction. Each footfall echoed softly in the high-ceilinged space, a measured drumbeat that marked the closing of one chapter and the deliberate opening of another. Around him, the world continued its ceaseless and different churn, flights called and flights delayed, hurried conversations and quiet sighs. But for Marcus, the clamor of the terminal had faded to a hush. The silence around him filled instead with the calm, resolute certainty of a man who had found his own ground. He paused at the threshold of the automatic doors, the whoosh of their opening, a gentle exhalation that greeted him as he stepped out into the cool air beyond. The world outside was bright and clear, the soft sweep of wind carrying the distant scent of jet fuel and the faint hum of engines in the sky above. Marcus inhaled deeply, the air crisp and clean in his lungs, and let it settle deep within him like a promise of movement, of change, of the quiet, unyielding power of a man who would not be erased. Behind him, the glass walls of the terminal glowed softly in the morning sun, the sleek, polished facade a mirror for the illusions it had once protected. But Marcus carried no bitterness as he looked back, only the calm satisfaction of a man who had taken a single moment of casual cruelty and turned it into a quiet, unstoppable reckoning. A man who understood that true justice was never about noise. It was about presence, about refusing to bend beneath the weight of a system that had never learned to see him clearly. He let the hush of the morning wrap around him, a soft counterpoint to the steady beat of his own heart. In that quiet, he felt the truth of what he had done settle into his bones. Not a victory measured in applause or headlines, but a deeper, more lasting triumph. The quiet triumph of integrity, of unwavering resolve, of knowing beyond doubt that dignity was not a seat assignment or a boarding pass. It was the unassailable foundation of who he was. As he walked toward the curb, the city spread out before him, alive with the endless possibility of movement and renewal. He could feel the tremors of the changes he had set in motion moving outward, invisible but undeniable, like the ripples of a stone cast into still water. And he knew that wherever they reached, whether in boardrooms or break rooms, in whispered conversations, or in the quiet, resolute choices of those who had once been complicit, the truth of what had happened here today would not be forgotten. Marcus Sinclair did not need to look back. He carried the knowledge of what he had done, the quiet strength of a man who had refused to be small. And as he stepped forward into the bright new day, his stride was steady, his posture unbowed. For him, the final act of this quiet reckoning was not in the closing of a door or the ending of a flight. It was in the unwavering conviction that he, and those who would follow him, would never again accept less than the full measure of their worth. The world around him buzzed with the quiet music of 1,000 small departures and arrivals, the endless, patient dance of movement that had always drawn him forward. And as he took his place in that current, his heart was calm, his mind clear. Because for Marcus Sinclair, this was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. A new story, a new chapter, a quiet, resolute future built on the unshakable foundation of dignity and quiet, unstoppable resolve. In a world that often measures worth by the smoothness of one's accent or the color of one's skin, Marcus Sinclair's journey reminds us that true power lies not in raising our voices, but in the quiet certainty of our worth. His refusal to accept the smallness of others' judgments became a ripple that turned into a wave, unseen by many, unstoppable by any. Let this story stand as a testament to the quiet power within us all, a reminder that dignity is not a privilege, but a birthright. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, share your thoughts below. Join us as we continue to uncover the silent reckonings that shape our world, and remind us all that real change begins not with noise, but with the unwavering decision to stand firm.